The chlorine-scented water rippled with an unnatural stillness as Evelyn Martinez watched Barbara Whitmore, the neighborhood's most notorious HOA Karen, stride across her pristine backyard. Again, without permission, without even a hint of embarrassment. It was the third time this month that Barbara had waltzed uninvited onto Evelyn's property, clipboard in hand, measuring tape dangling from her manicured fingers like a weapon of suburban destruction. The wooden fence separating their properties might as well have been tissue paper for all the respect Barbara showed property lines. Violation. Barbara's shrill voice cut through the quiet afternoon like a laser. Your pool fence does not meet Section 4.2, subsection C of the Oakwood Estates Homeowners Association Architectural Guidelines. Evelyn gripped her iced tea so tightly that condensation dripped between her fingers. She'd moved to this supposedly peaceful neighborhood 3 years ago, dreaming of tranquility after a messy divorce. Instead, she'd landed in Barbara Whitmore's personal kingdom of petty bureaucratic tyranny. The HOA Karen wore her typical uniform: pressed khaki capris, a pastel polo shirt with an embroidered HOA logo, and sensible walking shoes that had traversed more lawns than most park rangers. Her silver-streaked hair was pulled back in a tight ponytail that seemed to communicate maximum disapproval with minimal effort. The fence is exactly 36 inches high, Evelyn said, her voice carefully controlled. Per regulations. Barbara's red ballpoint pen hovered over her clipboard. Her reading glasses, hung on a bejeweled chain, bounced against her chest as she leaned closer to inspect the fence. Measurements require verification. What Barbara really meant was, I'm going to find something wrong. Always. This wasn't about rules. This was about power, about control. Barbara Whitmore had transformed the HOA into her personal fiefdom, and every homeowner was her reluctant subject. She'd successfully forced 3 families to repaint their homes, 2 to remove unauthorized garden decorations, and once made a retired couple replace their entire front lawn because the grass wasn't the approved shade of green. Evelyn knew the game. She watched Barbara operate for months, meticulously documenting every potential infraction with the dedication of a forensic accountant. But today felt different. Today, something inside Evelyn snapped. As Barbara continued her inspection, muttering about microscopic fence imperfections, a wild idea began to take shape. Not just a response to Barbara's constant harassment, but a statement, a declaration of suburban rebellion that would become neighborhood legend. The pool, the perfect canvas for her revenge. Barbara continued measuring, completely unaware that her next trespass would be her last. Evelyn's lips curved into a smile that was equal parts mischief and calculation. Sometimes, to defeat a Karen, you needed to think like a Karen, but with significantly more creativity. And Evelyn had creativity in abundance. The local restaurant supply store wasn't used to customers like Evelyn Martinez. While most buyers grabbed industrial-sized cooking pans or commercial mixers, she methodically loaded her cart with massive boxes of industrial-strength gelatin powder. The cashier raised an eyebrow but said nothing. 17 cases should do it, Evelyn muttered to herself, her fingers scrolling through online HOA regulations on her phone. Pool specifications, fence heights, acceptable colors. She knew every single rule by heart now. Not because she wanted to follow them, but because she needed to outsmart Barbara Whitmore at her own game. Her research had been meticulous. Industrial gelatin wasn't just a childhood party trick. It was a precise science. At the right consistency, it could support substantial weight. At the wrong consistency, it became a trap more effective than any HOA violation notice. Evelyn's best friend Miguel had initially thought she was joking. A Jello trap? For the HOA Karen? He'd asked, watching her calculate precise gelatin-to-water ratios on her kitchen counter. Not just a trap, Evelyn corrected, a statement. The planning had taken weeks. Color selection alone consumed 3 evenings. She needed something professional yet undeniably visible. Lime green seemed perfect, bright enough to be noticed, official-looking enough to seem almost intentional. Her garage transformed into a gelatin laboratory. Industrial mixers borrowed from a catering friend. Massive cooling tanks strategically positioned. Temperature-controlled environment maintained with scientific precision. This wasn't some amateur prank. This was engineered revenge. Miguel helped, partly out of curiosity, partly out of a deep-seated hatred for HOA bureaucrats. You realize this is borderline criminal? He'd asked, stirring a massive vat of green gelatin. Technically, Evelyn replied, I'm just maintaining my pool to HOA specifications. The mathematical calculations were complex. Gelatin density, weight distribution, surface tension, pool volume. Each variable carefully considered to create the perfect trap, not to harm Barbara, just to teach her a lesson about respecting property lines. Neighborhood gossip had long painted Barbara as untouchable. She'd successfully sued neighbors for minor infractions. She'd had landscaping removed. She forced homeowners to repaint entire houses over color variations barely perceptible to the human eye. But Evelyn wasn't most neighbors. Her background in engineering gave her an advantage. Where others saw rules, she saw systems to be understood, manipulated, perfected. The HOA bylaws weren't a constraint. They were a puzzle waiting to be solved. As the first massive batch of lime green gelatin cooled in her carefully prepared pool, Evelyn allowed herself a smile. Barbara Whitmore had spent years turning the neighborhood into her personal fiefdom. Now it was time for a royal lesson in humility. The pool shimmered, a massive green, gelatinous canvas of suburban justice. The HOA monthly meeting always followed the same predictable script. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead in the community center's beige conference room. Uncomfortable folding chairs, stale coffee, and Barbara Whitmore presiding with the precision of a military tribunal. Evelyn had never been more prepared. Her email arrived exactly 3 days before the meeting, a meticulously crafted invitation that would make Barbara unable to resist. Pool compliance demonstration, the subject line read, attached preliminary measurements, fence specifications, and a request for an official HOA inspection. Barbara's response was instantaneous. A reply within 6 minutes, a record even for her. Ms. Martinez, the email began, your proactive approach to resolving potential architectural violations noted. I will personally conduct a comprehensive pool area inspection this Saturday at 2 p.m. sharp. Hook, line, and sinker. Miguel watched Evelyn prepare, equal parts impressed and terrified. You do realize this is basically declaring war on the neighborhood's most powerful Karen? Evelyn just smiled. Her garage looked like a mad scientist's laboratory. Industrial mixers, temperature-controlled cooling tanks, precise measuring equipment. The lime green gelatin had been engineered with mathematical precision. Not too soft, not too firm, exactly perfect. This isn't about revenge, Evelyn explained. This is about boundaries, literal and metaphorical. The neighborhood had suffered under Barbara's tyrannical rule for years. She forced the Hendersons to remove a memorial garden for their deceased son because it didn't meet landscaping guidelines. She made the Garcias repaint their entire house because the shade of beige was 3 points off the approved color chart. Her clipboard was a weapon, her rulebook an instrument of suburban oppression. Evelyn had collective stories, documented everything. The HOA meetings were her research, each complaint a data point in her growing case against Barbara's reign of terror. Her phone buzzed. Another neighbor, anonymously texting, good luck. We're all behind you. The community was tired, beaten down, and Evelyn was about to become their unlikely hero. Saturday approached with surgical precision. The pool waited, a massive lime green canvas of gelatinous potential. Temperature perfect. Consistency calculated. Every single HOA regulation meticulously considered and technically followed. Barbara would inspect the pool. Of that, Evelyn was certain. What happened next would become neighborhood legend. The sprinklers were timed, the gelatin's surface tension carefully engineered, the approach mathematically plotted. Evelyn had become something more than just a homeowner. She was an architect of suburban justice, ready to transform a simple pool inspection into a moment of reckoning. Barbara Whitmore had no idea what was coming. Saturday arrived with picture-perfect suburban stillness. Lawn edges precisely trimmed, sprinklers timed to the minute, and Evelyn Martinez waiting, studying calculated calm. Barbara Whitmore's Mercedes SUV turned onto the street exactly at 1:55 p.m. Punctuality was her religion and rules were her sacred text. She pulled into Evelyn's driveway with the confidence of a woman who had never, not once in her 63 years, been proven wrong. The clipboard was freshly laminated, her sensible shoes polished to a military shine. Barbara adjusted her HOA-branded polo shirt and marched toward the backyard with military precision. Evelyn opened the gate, her smile professional and practiced. Right on time, Ms. Whitmore. Inspection, Barbara announced as if the word itself carried legal authority. Pool area compliance review. The pool looked deceptively normal, its surface a perfect shade of lime green, official enough to seem intentional, bizarre enough to be intriguing. Evelyn had ensured every possible regulation was not just met, but exceeded. I prepared all documentation, Evelyn said, gesturing to a thick binder on the patio table. Meticulously organized, color-coded, each section tabbed and highlighted. Barbara's eyes narrowed. Something was different today. The air felt charged with an electricity she couldn't quite define. The first step onto the pool deck happened precisely at 2:03 p.m. Barbara's sensible shoes, those weapons of mass administrative destruction, pressed against the surface. For a millisecond, nothing happened. Then physics and Evelyn's carefully engineered plan took over. The gelatin's surface tension, mathematically calculated to the millimeter, held for exactly 1.7 seconds. Just long enough for Barbara to feel a false sense of security, just long enough for her to take a second step. Then, catastrophically, wonderfully, the lime green surface began to ripple. Barbara Whitmore, terror of Oakwood Estates, destroyer of landscaping dreams, ruler of municipal minutiae, began to sink. Not quickly, not violently, but with a slow, inexorable descent that could only be described as poetic justice. Her clipboard flew from her hands. Her perfectly pressed khakis disappeared first, then her HOA polo, then her shoulders. Her look of absolute shock was the last thing to descend into the lime green abyss. Evelyn watched, perfectly still, perfectly calm. One neighborhood rule stated that pool surfaces must be uniform and consistent. Technically, her gelatin pool met every single specification, just not in the way anyone had ever imagined. A muffled "what in the" emerged from the green surface, and silence. Somewhere in the neighborhood, a dog barked. A sprinkler clicked on. The world continued, except in this one backyard where suburban warfare had just reached its magnificent crescendo. The first police officer arrived 23 minutes after Barbara Whitmore disappeared into the lime green gelatin. Officer Rodriguez approached the scene with the weary resignation of someone who had seen everything, or so he thought. "Ma'am," he said to Evelyn, "we received a complaint about something unusual." Evelyn pointed to her meticulously prepared binder. "I have all the necessary documentation, pool surface compliance, structural integrity reports, HOA regulation cross-references." Rodriguez's partner, a younger officer named Martinez, tried to suppress a laugh as he peered at the gelatin pool. A sensible shoe bobbed near the surface. A clipboard floated like a sad, bureaucratic life preserver. "She came onto my property," Evelyn explained calmly, "uninvited, for an inspection I did not formally request." The body camera footage would later become legendary, not for any dramatic confrontation, but for the absolute professionalism with which Evelyn presented her case. Each document tabbed, each regulation cited, the gelatin pool sitting there, a perfect shade of lime green, like the most bizarre piece of suburban performance art. Miguel arrived, bringing iced tea and attempting to look innocent. "Just checking on my friend," he said, not quite meeting the officer's eyes. The neighborhood had already begun to gather. Curtains twitched, garage doors opened slightly. Smartphones emerged, capturing every moment. "Technically," Evelyn continued, "my pool surface meets all HOA regulations. Uniform consistency, approved color range, structural integrity maintained." Rodriguez flipped through the binder, his expression shifting from confusion to something approaching respect. The documentation was flawless, mathematically precise. Each page a testament to Evelyn's engineering background and Barbara's own bureaucratic obsessiveness. "Ms. Whitmore entered without permission," Evelyn added. "I merely maintain my property within specified guidelines." A muffled sound emerged from the gelatin, something between a grunt and a complaint. Rodriguez cleared his throat. "Ma'am, we're going to need you to explain exactly what happened here." Evelyn raised an eyebrow. "Would you like to see the compliance documentation?" The younger officer, Martinez, was losing his battle with laughter. The gelatin pool bubbled slightly, another muffled complaint rising from its depths. Neighbors began to emerge. The Hendersons, the Garcias, faces that had suffered under Barbara's HOA tyranny for years. They watched with a mixture of disbelief and carefully concealed joy. One thing was certain, the Oakwood Estates Homeowners Association would never be the same. As the first rescue attempts began, carefully, methodically, with the same precision Barbara would have demanded, Evelyn sipped her iced tea. Her plan had worked perfectly. Not as revenge, but as a statement. Sometimes to beat a Karen, you had to out-Karen the Karen. The emergency HOA meeting looked like a war council. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. Folding chairs creaked under the weight of nervous energy. And at the center of it all, Evelyn Martinez, calm as a summer morning. Barbara Whitmore sat 2 rows back, wrapped in a pale green blanket that did little to hide the lingering traces of lime green gelatin. Her clipboard, her sacred weapon, was conspicuously absent. "Violation of property access protocols," Barbara muttered, her voice a rasp of pure indignation. The new HOA board president, Richard Henderson, whose memorial garden Barbara had once forced him to remove, cleared his throat. His eyes held a glimmer of barely concealed satisfaction. "Miss Martinez," he began, "we've reviewed the documentation regarding the incident." Evelyn's binder sat on the table, 57 pages of meticulously researched regulations, cross-referenced, highlighted, annotated. Each page a weapon more precise than any clipboard. Miguel sat in the back, looking like a proud coach before a championship match. The neighborhood watched. This was more than a meeting. This was revolution. "The pool surface," Evelyn explained, "meets all specified HOA guidelines. Uniform consistency. Approved color range. structural integrity maintained. Each word was delivered with surgical precision. Barbara's face cycled through colors: shock, anger, humiliation. The woman who had terrorized the neighborhood for years now sat diminished, literally and figuratively. Richard Henderson flipped through the documentation. An engineer himself, he appreciated precision, and Evelyn's work was nothing if not precise. "Ms. Whitmore," he said, "you've entered the property without explicit permission." Ms. Martinez's response, while unconventional, appears to fall within the realm of property protection. The room held its breath. Whispers rippled through the crowd. The Garcias, the Johnsons, families who had suffered under Barbara's reign. Their eyes held hope. Hope that something might finally change. Furthermore, Richard continued, "We're implementing new guidelines about unauthorized property inspections." Barbara's mouth opened, closed, opened again. Miguel leaned forward, whispering to Evelyn, "You're a legend now." But Evelyn wasn't celebrating. This was never about victory. This was about boundaries, about respect, about stopping a system of petty tyranny that had gone unchecked for too long. The vote was unanimous. No action would be taken against Evelyn. The gelatin pool, now drained, stood as a monument to suburban rebellion. Outside, the neighborhood felt different, lighter, as if something fundamental had shifted. Barbara Whitmore would never look at a clipboard the same way again. 6 months after the Great Gelatin Incident, as it had become known, Oakwood Estates looked different, subtly at first, then dramatically. The HOA bylaws underwent a complete overhaul. No longer were they weapons of mass harassment. Now they read like a community charter, reasonable, flexible, human. Richard Henderson's engineering background combined with Evelyn's meticulous research had transformed the document from a set of punitive regulations to a guide for neighborhood harmony. Barbara Whitmore had retreated, not completely defeated, but significantly diminished. She'd sold her house 3 months after the incident, unable to bear the whispers, the knowing looks, the subtle mockery that followed her every move. The new homeowners were different, a young couple, both teachers. They hung wind chimes, planted a community garden, invited neighbors over for barbecues. Evelyn discovered she'd become something of a local hero, not that she sought the attention. Miguel joked that she was the neighborhood's accidental revolutionary. "I didn't want to be a symbol," she told him during their weekly coffee meetup. "I just wanted respect." The ripple effects spread beyond Oakwood Estates. Neighboring communities began reviewing their HOA practices. Local news picked up the story, not as a sensationalist piece, but as a serious examination of community governance. Miguel had created a website, the Gelatin Precedent, he called it, a resource for homeowners fighting unreasonable HOA regulations. It went viral unexpectedly, becoming a beacon for suburban resistance. "You've changed how people think about community rules," Miguel would say. But for Evelyn, it was never about fame. It was about drawing a line, about showing that bureaucratic bullying had limits. Her engineering background had always been about solving problems, creating systems that worked. The HOA was just another system, one that needed recalibration. The neighborhood block parties became legendary. Where once there were rigid rules and suspicious glances, now there was community. Shared potlucks, kids playing together, neighbors actually knowing each other's names. The pool where the Great Gelatin Incident occurred, Evelyn had it redesigned, not as a weapon, but as a community space, a place where neighbors could gather, where children could swim, where barbecues happened. On warm Saturday afternoons, you could find her there, watching, smiling, knowing that sometimes the most powerful weapon against bureaucratic tyranny is creativity, precision, and a willingness to stand up and say, "Enough." The clipboard had been replaced by conversation, rigid rules by mutual respect, and it all started with a pool, a whole lot of lime green gelatin, and one woman who refused to be pushed around.